About how much time is left on each side?
Maryland has 4.5 minutes. From Georgia, and 1/4 minutes.
I yield 2 minutes to the gentleman from Vermont, Mr. Welch.
Gentleman from Vermont is recognized for 2 minutes.
I thank the gentleman. There's a reason that this institution of Congress is so discredited among the American people. And the reason is quite simple. Instead of facing the problem, we come up with ways to avoid it. These two bills, dynamic scoring, which basically has as a premise that any tax cut is going to increase revenues, and baseline reform that essentially says that inflation is not a factor in depleting resources to meet a need, whether it's the Pentagon or it's health care, that somehow that's going to solve the problem. With the debt, that is a serious problem in this country. And you know what? It's time for Congress to acknowledge the obvious, and that is the problem is the problem. These runaround reforms about the process avoids the direct head-on confrontation that is the debt. And the debt is a function of too much spending and too little revenue. And bottom line, if you are a household, you're a local government, you're someone who's responsible, when you have a debt problem, you're going to look at everything, you're going to put it all on the table. There are 100 members of the House of Representatives who signed a letter and said, hey, let's put everything on the table, revenues and spending. It's the only way we're going to get a solution. This approach is avoiding that. It's locking down on the notion that any tax cut is going to increase revenues. It's locking down on the notion that revenues cannot be part of the solution. And it's locking down on this notion that if you wipe away inflation as a factor in what we need to do to maintain level funding, somehow we'll still meet the needs. You know, we had a war in Iraq and Afghanistan, 2 wars that weren't paid for, both on the credit card. We had a Medicare prescription drug program on the credit card. Whether you supported those as a Democrat or Republican, and we had people on both sides of the aisle that did, you've got to pay for it. We didn't pay for it. We're paying now the consequences of it. These so-called reforms about the process, it's always legitimate to figure out about the process. How can we do it better? How can we get better information? But not when it means we avoid the problem. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Again, Mr. Chairman, I'm a little perplexed by the arguments being used in opposition on the other side. My friend from Vermont says that this assumes that there's a certain premise about tax cuts. Well, the bill doesn't even use the language tax cuts. It uses tax revenue. It could be a tax reduction, could be a tax increase. Let's look. Let's find the information. Let's give our colleagues as much information as possible, which again is what my friend from Vermont says every family in this country does when they have a challenge. They've got a debt challenge. They get all of the information that they can. Mr. Chairman, that's simply what we're asking here, is to provide as much information as possible for members of Congress to make wiser decisions. I'm so pleased to yield my colleague from South Carolina, a member of the committee, 3 minutes.
Gentleman from South Carolina is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank my colleague. You know, as we sit like good congressmen and women in our offices and watch these debates on television, sometimes we feel compelled to run over and participate in the debate, and certainly that's what drove me over here today. And it's hard to know where to start, Mr. Chairman. There's a long list of things that we could talk about here today. We could start, for example, with the gentleman from Maryland who offered again today, as he did in Budget Committee, that the suggestion that perhaps the Recovery Act generated as many as 6 million jobs. If you actually listen very closely what he says, though, and read the documents that he cites, that's up to 6 million jobs saved or created. And the truth of the matter is that we could make just as easily the argument that the number is closer to 1.2 million jobs saved or created. That's assuming that a job saved is a job created. You could have a discussion as to whether or not we should have been spending $400,000 per job, but that's not the reason we're here. And I would suggest to my friends across the aisle, if they really believed that the Recovery Act was so wonderful, bring it up again. Please, offer us another one. In fact, bring us one twice the size and look the American people in the eye and say $800 billion wasn't enough. We want $1.6 trillion worth of another stimulus bill. Please bring that and let the President defend that as we have this discussion between now and November. You could also, Mr. Chairman, go into more detail about what the gentleman from North Carolina mentioned about the pay-go rules, something I'm a little bit familiar with. My predecessor was a big supporter of the pay-go rules. The pay-go rules were in place when this government ran up its largest deficits in history. The rule was never designed to cut spending, never designed to lower the deficit. It never accomplished what folks so fondly in hindsight believe that it did in the late 1990s. You could go back and look, and really what drove the surpluses of the late 1990s was the reduction in the size of the federal government. But again, not what we're here to talk about today. What the gentleman from Texas was talking about, however, is spot on. And he would come to the well, as so many folks on the other side will, and say that, well, it was those Bush tax cuts that really got us in the hole that we're in. I don't know why we call them the Bush tax cuts, by the way. They were extended by a Democrat president, a Democrat Senate, and a Democrat House at the end of 2010. I've always referred to them as the Bush-Obama tax cuts, but that doesn't seem to catch on. But the assertion has always been that after those tax cuts, Mr. Chairman, went into place, that revenues went down. That when we cut taxes, revenue went down, because certainly that's what the CBO, under the current rules, would tell you what happened. Under the static models that are in place now, when we supposedly cut taxes, the CBO would tell you, well, if you lower the tax rates, revenues will go down. Unequivocally, not what happened with the Bush tax cuts in the 2000s. Revenues went up every year from 2003 through the beginning of the Great Recession. And that's why this bill is so important, Mr. Chairman. Washington does not know how to count. We count in this town in a fashion that only this town counts it. The whole rest of the world doesn't understand how we count, and the CBO scoring is a big part of that problem. And, Mr. Chairman, that's why I respectfully suggest that we need to pass this bill and send it over to the Senate, and I thank you for your time.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Maryland.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would inquire, Mr. Price, do you have any more speakers?
I'm prepared to close.
Prepared to close. Okay. Mr. Chairman?
Gentleman's recognized.
Look, I think everybody in this body understands that the more good information we get, the better. That's why it's troubling that in this particular bill, we're asking the question of CBO in a way that will only give us partial information. I already mentioned that we left out the impact, the economic impact, from what we think should be included. We think the appropriations, investments, and transportation should be included in any economic analysis. Clearly, important investments we make in science and research and innovation in our infrastructure have an economic impact. But this doesn't ask for any of that information. There will be some amendments that say we should. Hopefully our colleagues will vote for them. But what is very bizarre is the way this is structured so that it doesn't require a macroeconomic dynamic analysis of the major change in law that we will make with respect to whether or not to extend all or some of the tax cuts, because the way it's written, it will assume those tax cuts are already in place. Now, we've already had an analysis that was done by the Joint Tax Committee, a macroeconomic dynamic analysis that does say at the end of that period it would actually have a drag on the economy because it increases the deficit. So let's make sure that we get full information, and on that score I do want to end by just pointing out that the most recent estimates from the Congressional Budget Office in terms of the impact of the recovery bill was in a document dated November 2011, and there's a chart in there that shows a range. Obviously, since the recovery bill is no longer in full effect in this current year, you don't continue to say the positive impacts. But Dr. Elmendorf has testified numerous times before the Budget Committee and indicated that had it not been for the passage of the recovery bill, had it not been for actions of the Federal Reserve, economic growth today would be much slower. That would mean more people out of work. We need to do better. We need to get things moving faster. That's why we should take up the President's jobs bill that's been sitting in this House since September. That's why I hope the Conference Committee on the Payroll Tax Cut Extension for 160 million people will get its done, get our job done quickly so that we can provide those opportunities to help the economy grow when it's in this very fragile state. So, Mr. Chairman, I just close by saying we all want information. Let's just not ask for information in a selective way designed to get a preconceived answer.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would appreciate the gentleman's comments, and I appreciate his perspective. However, it's clear that the revised reports, every single revised report on the stimulus comes up and states that it is costing more. It's costing the economy more. And that the jobs that are created, quote, created, decrease every time there's a new estimate. And so we're approaching zero jobs saved or created. In short time, I suspect we'll be at jobs lost from the stimulus. In fact, no, thank you, though. In fact, the CBO director yesterday in committee said, quote, "The extra government spending from the Recovery Act of 2009, unless there are offsetting changes made that pay off the extra debt that was incurred, the economy will be worse off," unquote. So it's interesting to see our colleagues on the other side continue to grab onto what they think is a lifeline of the stimulus bill that with time looks worse and worse. And maybe, Mr. Chairman, if we had only had this piece of legislation at the time of the attempted adoption or the adoption of the stimulus bill, so-called stimulus bill, maybe somebody would have thought differently. Maybe they would have recognized that, in fact, it wasn't going to have that it was going to have the real effect that it has, which is to decrease the vitality of the economy. Mr. Chairman, it's pretty doggone simple. This bill's pretty simple. Do you want more information, or do you want less information? This is remarkable common sense. I would suggest, Mr. Chairman, that it ought to be common ground upon which this House can stand. I urge my colleagues to adopt this piece of legislation, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. All time for general debate has expired. Pursuant to the rule, the bill shall be considered for amendment under the 5-minute rule. In lieu of the amendment in the nature of a substitute recommended by the Committee on the Budget printed in the bill, it shall be in order to consider as an original bill for the purpose of amendment under the 5-minute rule, an amendment in the nature of a substitute consisting of the text of the Rules Committee, print 112-10, dated January 25, 2012. That amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered read. No amendment to that amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be in order except those printed in Part B of House Report 112-383. Each such amendment may be offered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by a member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and opponent, shall be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 1, printed in Part B of House Report 112-383. For what purpose does the gentleman from Michigan seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk, Mr. Chairman.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 1, printed in Part B of House Report Number 112-383, offered by Mr. Peters of Michigan.
Pursuant to House Resolution 534, the gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Peters, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Michigan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I rise today in support of the Peters Amendment to H.R. 3582, the Pro-Growth Budgeting Act of 2011. As we consider legislation that would mandate the Congressional Budget Office use dynamic scoring to evaluate the macroeconomic impact of large tax cuts, we literally cannot afford to ignore the lessons of the past decade. My Republican colleagues want to enact this seemingly subtle change so that they can more easily advance their agenda of tax cuts for the rich while slashing critical programs that American families and workers rely on each and every day. Dynamic scoring supporters back this legislation in large part because it can mask the cost of tax cuts while ignoring the multiplier effects that investments in education, public health, and infrastructure can provide. In order to evaluate these claims, we need only look at the claims made by those who supported the 2001 and 2003 tax cuts and see how they stack up next to reality. Despite pledges from the Bush administration that the tax cuts of 2001 and 2003 would generate such significant economic activity that they would pay for themselves, we know that this is not the case. This is why I have put forward an amendment that will simply add factual findings section that details the impact of the tax cuts of 2001 and 2003 without altering the functional aspects of the bill. These findings include, 1, On January 8, 2003, White House Press Secretary Ari Fleischer said that President Bush believed that the tax cut package enacted in 2001 and expanded in 2003 would, quote, create additional revenues for the federal government and pay for itself. Two, before the tax cuts of 2001 and 3 were enacted, the Congressional Budget Office projected gradually rising surpluses from 2.7% of gross national product in 2001 to 5.3% of gross national product in 2011, with federal government operating debt-free by 2009. We know this, of course, did not happen. And instead, the Congressional Budget Office estimates that the tax cuts of 2001 and 3 have added over $2 trillion to budget deficits from 2002 to 11. Despite signing tax cuts of 2001 and 3 into law, President Bush's administration had, according to the Wall Street Journal, quote, the worst track record for job creation since the government began keeping records in 1939. From 2001 to 2009, gross domestic products grew at the slowest pace for any period since 1953. And median household income declined during the Bush administration for the first time since 1967, when this data first was tracked. We all have lived through this past decade and have seen the damaging effects the Bush tax cuts have had on our federal budget. I think it's safe to say that anyone who can possibly claim to belong to the reality caucus agrees that the Bush tax cuts not only contributed to taking our nation from budget surpluses to massive deficits, but also contributed to unprecedented levels of income inequality. If Congress cannot learn from past mistakes, we are destined to repeat them. I urge my colleagues to support my simple, factual amendment to show that Congress understands the true impact of the Bush tax cuts and recognize that while tax cuts might stimulate additional economic activity, the tax cuts of 2001 and 3 certainly did not pay for themselves. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. What purpose does the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I claim time in opposition.
Gentleman's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It is a little amusing, I guess, that our colleagues on the other side love to talk about the past. I'm not sure whether it's a desire for fantasy or misery, but talking about the past is interesting. But this amendment has absolutely nothing to do with the legislation that's being considered. We don't need to rehash the economic record of the last 10 years. We need to look forward, and that's what this bill does. It's a forward-looking piece of legislation, and looking forward, as the CBO reported on Tuesday, is that if tax relief is allowed to expire at the end of this year, which seems to be what my colleagues on the other side are advocating, we would then have the largest tax increase in the history of our country. CBO says that economic growth will be as much as 3% lower than it would be if that tax relief were extended. So what we need is dynamic, appropriate scoring, more information, more data for our colleagues to be able to have that kind of information so when they make decisions they'll make, again, hopefully wiser decisions. This amendment truly makes no improvement whatsoever to our process, our budget process, and I urge its defeat and yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Michigan is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, well, I find it interesting that the speaker from the other side believes that this is fantasy. This is facts, and he believes that facts should not be part of the debate, which is probably why we are in the trouble that we are in right now, when the majority party believes that opinions should not be weighed down by the facts of the situation. What I am offering in this statement is simply factual statements that don't detract in any way from this intended impact of this legislation, but it's certainly important to having a full and honest debate that we need to have an understanding of what happened in the past. If we do not have that understanding of the past, if we don't step up to the reality of what actually occurred as a result of missteps in public policy in the past, we will repeat them once again. What I'm hearing from the majority party is that they want to repeat the mistakes of the past, mistakes that led to uncontrollable deficits, and also mistakes that gave huge windfalls to the wealthiest people in this country at the expense of middle-class taxpayers. As a Democrat, We are very proud to stand up for middle-class families and want to make sure that tax benefits to middle-class taxpayers continue to go to those families that are struggling each and every day. On the other hand, those, the wealthiest among us, those with the highest incomes that have reaped the most benefit should be paying their fair share. And by having tax cuts, what we will do is cut into those middle-class families. This is a factual statement. If we do not recognize the reality of the facts, we are doomed to repeat those mistakes. I urge adoption of this amendment.
Gentleman's time has expired. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Michigan. Those in favor will signify by saying aye. Those opposed, no. No. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, ayes and nays.
Does the gentleman ask for a recorded vote?
Yes, I do, Mr. Chairman.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Michigan will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 2, printed in Part B of House Report 112-383. For what purpose does the gentleman from Virginia seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 2, printed in Part B of House Report Number 112-383, offered by Mr. Connolly of Virginia.
Pursuant to House Resolution 534, the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Virginia for 5 minutes.
I thank the chair. Mr. Chairman, this is a simple yet important amendment that will in fact deliver the actual transparency the proponents of this bill claim to be providing. My amendment will ensure the dynamic scoring called for in this legislation and will capture the broader economic effects of federal spending as well as federal tax cuts. The way this bill is written, to exclude appropriations bills, highlights the political intent of the authors of this bill to only take into account the effect of tax cuts. Both spending federal tax dollars and sending them back have economic consequences. We all know that. And looking at just one side of the ledger is nothing more than political gamesmanship. Of course, my Republican friends have cleverly baked into the base a permanent extension of the Bush tax cuts, which CBO already has said would create a drag on the economy in the long term. But I guess we don't want to let the facts or sound economic policy get in our way. That's why my amendment would include the appropriations, will fix that disparity, and provide us a clearer picture of the economic effects of all of our actions. As my Republican friends seem to have forgotten, the federal government has had a long history of partnering with the private sector. And our nation's universities in support of basic research are a great illustration. These investments spur American innovation and provide measurable, tangible economic benefits. For example, the federal government's invested $12.8 billion in the Human Genome Project since it began in 1988. According to a recent report by the Battelle Technology Partnership Practice, the total economic investment of that one project and its return has exceeded $780 billion. In 2010 alone, the field of genomics directly supported 51,000 jobs in this country and another 310,000 indirect jobs. It generated $67 billion in economic activity last year and resulted in $3.7 billion coming to the federal treasury. The economic return on that single federal investment has been significant and bears consideration as my Republican colleagues are trying to retrench on such spending. While not every appropriation will have a similar positive economic result, like the Human Genome Project, the economic effect of each should nonetheless be considered by this Congress as it actually appropriates funds. My amendment will simply correct that oversight and provide proper balance to the accountability and transparency the authors of the bill say they wish to achieve. I ask my colleagues to support this amendment. If Congress is serious about capturing the true impact of all of our actions in the economy, we ought to consider all of them, including spending and appropriations. I reserve the balance.
Gentleman reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I claim time in opposition.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, this amendment is what professors of logic, now I know that there's not a whole lot of logic around this town, but professors of logic would call a nullity. Adopting this amendment would not require CBO to prepare an analysis of bills reported from the Appropriations Committee, as my good friend from Virginia desires. Section 407 of the Congressional Budget Act requires CBO to prepare a macroeconomic impact analysis of, quote, major bills or resolutions, unquote, which is the term that's defined in Section 2 of the bill. Section 2 of the bill uses cost estimates prepared by the CBO under Section 402 of the Congressional Budget Act. Section 402 does not apply to bills reported from the Appropriations Committee. So this amendment accomplishes absolutely nothing. Even if the amendment were properly drafted, it would be meaningless to require a 40-year macroeconomic impact analysis for a one-year appropriations bill. Even the largest appropriations bill, the defense appropriations bill, is only about 3% of the gross domestic product in 1 year, or much less than 1% of the GDP over a 10-year period of time. So the macroeconomic impact of one-year legislation is oftentimes approaches zero and then can be changed with the next succeeding appropriations bills in years 2 and 3 and 4. So the amendment is drafted in such a way that it has no effect whatsoever. Even if it were properly drafted, it's a bad idea without providing any new meaningful information for Congress, and I urge defeat of the amendment and yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Virginia.
I would inquire of the Chair how much time remains on this side.
Gentleman has 2 minutes remaining.
Mr. Chairman, I would simply point out that the same logic my friend from Georgia uses about a simple one-year appropriation may not have much measurable impact on the economy could also apply to tax cuts, short-term tax cuts. I would further point out that his opposition to a simple improvement, and I have only 2 minutes. His opposition to a simple improvement to this bill, I think, gives the lie to the intent of the bill. It exposes what's really going on here. Let's try to find a facile way to guarantee the Bush tax cuts are extended and the tax cutting is even easier on the wealthier who ought to be paying their fair share. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Virginia. Those in favor will signify by saying aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the Chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Virginia.
On that, I would ask for a recorded vote.
The recorded vote having been requested pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Virginia will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 3, printed in Part B of House Report 112-383. For what purpose does the gentleman from Minnesota seek recognition?
I have an amendment at the desk, Mr. Chairman.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 3, printed in Part B of House Report Number 112-383, offered by Mr. Walz of Minnesota.
Pursuant to House Resolution 534, the gentleman from Minnesota, Mr. Walz, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The Chair recognizes the gentleman from Minnesota.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield myself as much time as I may consume. I'd first of all like to thank the Chairman and the Ranking Member for making my amendment in order, granting me the opportunity to address this. I rise today to offer what I think is a very common-sense amendment to the underlying bill. There's some of this debate that there's very little to debate about. Our national debt is nearly $15 trillion. We're borrowing about 30 cents on every dollar. This represents, in my opinion, one of the biggest threats to our economic future, and I believe it needs to be a top priority. But I also believe the first step in addressing our national debt is getting honest about how we calculate it and the impact of it. That means we have to take the right factors into account, and that includes the impact that higher deficits will have on our economy. As you know, one of the problems, the main problems with deficits is they push up interest rates. Eventually, it will happen. Higher interest rates hurt the economy by making it more expensive to buy a home or a car. They make it harder for my constituents to afford college for their children, and they make it more difficult for local businesses to get credit they need to grow. My amendment would simply ensure that the Congressional Budget Office and the Joint Committee on Taxation expressly include interest rates in the list of economic factors they consider in their studies. If we don't consider interest rates, the underlying bill would underestimate the impact of the unpaid government spending or the unoffset tax cuts would have on the economy and the deficit. Congress has to stop hiding behind the funny math and mask the true costs of our policies. I'd like to stress that my amendment is nonpartisan and non-ideological. It's completely neutral on whether the deficit is increased by unpaid-for spending or unoffset tax cuts. The effects are the same. It simply ensures that Congress, when we take a vote, takes into account whether it was done in a fiscally responsible manner. We must let facts
drive our decision-making, not ideology. If the facts dispute our ideology, we need to change our ideology, not the other way around. As a high school teacher, one thing I know for sure is you need to start by getting the math right. I reserve the balance of my time, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition?
Claim time in opposition, though I'm not opposed.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to commend my colleague from Minnesota for recognizing the wisdom of the legislation and the importance of looking at the dynamism of the economy and effects that ought to be relayed to us from the Congressional Budget Office. The Congressional Budget Office's macroeconomic analysis oftentimes already includes interest rates if the effects are relevant. However, we believe that this amendment helps clarify that, and we have no objection to the adoption of this amendment. And I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentleman from Minnesota.
Mr. Chairman, I thank the gentleman for having that opportunity and for allowing this to go forward, and at that time I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Minnesota. Those in favor will signify by saying aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 4, printed in Part B of House Report 112-383. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Ohio seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 4, printed in Part B of House Report Number 112-383, offered by Ms. Fudge of Ohio.
Pursuant to House Resolution 534, the gentlewoman from Ohio, Ms. Fudge, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Ohio.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. And I thank the Rules Committee and I thank the Chairman for making this amendment in order. Mr. Chairman, today I rise to offer an amendment to H.R. 3582, the Pro-Growth Budgeting Act of 2011. The Pro-Growth Budgeting Act requires the Congressional Budget Office to provide an impact analysis in addition to a score when legislation would have a budgetary effect greater than 0.25% of GDP. The bill requires certain variables to be considered to determine economic impact. As the bill is currently written, the variables considered include impact on real GDP, business investment, the capital stock, employment, and labor supply. The bill describes these variables as major economic variables. One of the most important economic variables is missing from H.R. 3582. My amendment would insert income equality among the variables used to determine economic impact. It would also require an estimate of the change in income equality to be included in an impact analysis. Income inequality is real in America. It's time we start making sure our laws strengthen the middle class, not weaken it. America is indeed the land of opportunity. It is one of the principles upon which our great nation was founded. Yet in 2012, if you are born into a low-income family, you will most likely grow up to be poor. 65% of Americans born into families with earnings in the bottom 5th percentile stay in the bottom 2/5, while 62% of those raised in families with earnings in the top 5th stay in the top 2/5. America has become a wealthier nation, but the wealth has bypassed the middle class. Between 1979 and 2007, overall American household incomes grew by 62%. The top 1% of earners saw their incomes increase by 275% over the past 30 years. That means their incomes nearly quadrupled. In comparison, 1/5 of households with the lowest incomes only saw their incomes increase by 18%. Although the pie is growing larger, middle-class Americans are watching their slices get smaller. Even some of my Republican colleagues have acknowledged the problem of economic immobility and wealth disparity in this nation. Clearly, if impact analysis are going to be required of the CBO, the factors considered must include income inequality. I urge my colleagues to support this amendment. I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentlewoman reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from South Carolina seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I claim time in opposition.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I rise today to draw attention to the fact that this appears to be a essentially where our colleagues across the aisle will be trying to be taking the national debate for the next 11 months. This is the politics of division. This is not the politics of unity. This is not the politics of trying to bring people together and hope of seeing the country succeed. It's the politics of trying to break us down into different classes. We hear a lot of talk, and we'll hear a lot of talk this year, about fairness, about the 1%. What we won't hear, Mr. Chairman, is that, for example, the top 1% of the wage earners in this country, the top 1%, make 20% of the income, but pay 40% of the taxes. You won't hear the other side say that won't have them define what is fairness. They just want more and more and more. In fact, when you do ask them to talk about what they would specifically have us do, which is go back to the Clinton-era tax rates on the top 1%, would pay only 8 cents of every dollar of deficit in this nation. It's not designed to solve any problems, Mr. Chairman, and neither is this amendment. It is designed to continue to try and define us. You can look at this amendment, sir, and know that it is simply offered for political gain. It doesn't even attempt to define income inequality in the bill or in the amendment. It's simply designed to make a political point. Furthermore, you can get this information from joint tax if you simply ask for it. That tool is already available to us. Mr. Chairman, Americans are not envious. They are more interested in how they are doing than whether or not their neighbors are succeeding. They are not envious, and we should not pass an amendment that assumes that they are. With that, I reserve the balance of my time.
Gentleman reserves. Gentlewoman from Ohio.
Can you tell me how much time I have remaining, Mr. Chairman?
The gentlelady has 2.5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. And let me just say for the record that I did not talk about class. My colleague did. Let me as well say to you that if you talk to the American people, they believe in fundamental fairness. I don't think that the American people do not believe in fairness. I further don't believe that American people live in a nation where they don't believe that they can ever accomplish the American dream. I don't believe that the American people believe that they cannot climb the ladders to success. I do not believe that we live in a nation where people do not believe that they can rise above their circumstances. So let me just say to my colleague, it's not about class. It's about the nation in which we live, the nation where people come from all over the world wanting to see what it means to be great, what it means to realize the American dream. That's the America that I'm talking about. This is not frivolous. This is what is right. This is what the American people want, and I urge my colleagues to support it. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. The gentleman from South Carolina.
Mr. Chairman, it's the 1st of February, the 2nd of February. We have roughly 10 months between now and the next election. It's plenty of time for the folks across the aisle to let us know what they mean by fairness. Tell us, what does it mean? When you say that we want a fair tax code, we want people to pay their fair share, would you please just let us know what that means in terms of raw numbers? Give us a real proposal as to what that means. And then give us a real proposal that actually solves the problem, because raising taxes on the top 1% simply will not accomplish what they say that it will. Again, it pays only 8 cents of every dollar worth of deficit. Let us know what fairness is, but I can assure you, Mr. Chairman, it is not this amendment. For that reason, I think we should defeat it.
Gentleman yields back. Question is on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Ohio. Those in favor will signify by saying aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. The amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, I ask for a recorded vote.
Recorded vote having been requested. Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Ohio will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 5, printed in Part B of House Report 112-383. For what purpose does the gentlewoman from Texas seek recognition? The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 5, printed in Part B of House Report Number 112-383, offered by Ms. Jackson Lee of Texas.
Pursuant to House Resolution 534, the gentlewoman from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Texas.
I, too, want to express my appreciation to the Rules Committee for allowing my amendment to come in, and I acknowledge the ranking member of our Budget Committee for his excellent service, Mr. Van Hollen. I thank Dr. Price for his presence here today and engaging in this discussion. In a few days, I will be meeting with a number of my clergy, along with my small business community, coming from all walks of life. and all of us have found in our hearts, our minds, to recognize that small business is, in fact, the backbone of this country. And so I would ask that as we look at the issue of macroeconomic analysis of this legislation, that we include a well-defined concept as to understand what the impact will be on hub zone areas as defined by the Small Business Act. H.R. 3582 would require the Congressional Budget Office to provide a macroeconomic impact analysis for bills that are estimated to have large budgetary effect. And under this bill, there would be analysis that would come about on a number of issues that would, in fact, involve the gross domestic product. The Small Business Administration administers several programs to support small businesses, including historically underused business zone empowerment, contracting, better known as the Hub Zone. The Hub Zone program is an effective program. It's a small business federal contracting assistance program that crosses the land. Wherever you live, you have the opportunity to participate in the Hub program, whose primary objective is job creation and increasing capital investment in distressed communities, irrespective of your location and your background. It provides participating small businesses located in areas with low income, high poverty rates, or high unemployment rates with contracting opportunities in the form of set-aside, sole source awards, and price evaluation preferences. Mr. Speaker, this could happen to any community. One moment you could be thriving and a tornado could come to you in the next moment and you fall in the category of a hub zone to revitalize small businesses. And so I ask my colleagues to support an amendment that spreads across America and to make the determination that the vitality of small businesses is important to all of us, and an assessment should be made using the hub zones and the impact such legislation would have. I reserve my time.
Gentlelady reserves. For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition?
To claim time in opposition.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank the gentlelady from Texas for offering this amendment, but I would suggest that the macroeconomic impact analysis that's required already by the legislation will analyze the effect of job growth and capital formation and economic growth. To add an additional criterion in the analysis is unnecessary and truly encourages focus on the interests in particular locations as opposed to the general welfare. This is one of those areas that is rightly worked out in committee, the discussion of these issues in committee. So I would suggest to the gentlelady from Texas that this is not the appropriate opportunity to try to add items to the bill that actually continues to confound the information that would be provided to members, and focus on dividing things as opposed to general information. If I may, Mr. Chairman, I just want to return to the bill itself and to discuss for just a moment the notion that there is some type of bias within the piece of legislation itself. We've heard our friends on the other side of the aisle talk about it's biasing positive information as it relates to tax cuts or tax reductions. Again, I would urge my colleagues who are listening to this and will be considering this piece of legislation in short order to read the legislation. Legislation says nothing about whether or not the dynamic scoring, the flexible scoring that ought to be available for members, that kind of information is going to look at tax reductions or tax increases, whether it's going to look at how that affects the overall vitality of the economy. In fact, what this does is to provide much greater information for our colleagues here to be making decisions. And as so many of my friends on our side of the aisle have testified to during this discussion on this piece of legislation, what's needed around here is more information. We now have an administration who has been marching to the Treasury to spend more and more and more and more and more and more money, plunging us into incredible debt, $1 trillion deficits for each of the 4 years of this current administration. $1 trillion, Mr. Chairman. We've never been there before. And it's clearly having an incredible dragging effect on the economy. Wouldn't it be wonderful to be able to have members offer pieces of legislation and have the Congressional Budget Office be able to tell us. Say, look, if you're going to insist on continuing down this road of debt and doubt and despair, this is the consequence in the real economy. The consequence is that it will continue to have a drag in the economy. Jobs will not be truly created, in spite of the guys from the administration that they talk about jobs being created or saved. Jobs won't be created. There's a better way. There is a better way, and the American people know there's a better way. And they know there's a better way that we can be informed. They know that more information for their member of Congress will allow their member of Congress to make wiser decisions. So all this bill is about, the Pro-Growth Budget Act, all it is about is an attempt to give you, to give me, to provide for every single member of this body, not biased information, not information that's gaming the system, information that allows for us to make wiser decisions. Wouldn't it have been wonderful, Mr. Chairman, if during some of the major legislation of the past couple of years, wouldn't it have been wonderful to have had an outside entity, hopefully objective entity, be able to weigh in and say, goodness gracious, if you spend $1 trillion of money that we don't have, this is going to be the consequence in the economy. This is going to be one of the outcomes of it, which is you're going to increase the debt in this country. You're going to decrease the sense that businesses out there have any certainty in the economy, and therefore they're not going to be able to create the kind of jobs that all of us desire and all of us want. That's the kind of information that we would have liked to have had. That's what we were saying at the time, and now it's beginning to play out. But it's playing out with incredible destruction in our communities across our great land, playing out in ways that makes it so that individuals are hurting and are harmed by the actions that were taken by the previous Congress and this administration. Wouldn't it have been wonderful to have that information so that people could weigh the options? I urge my colleagues to defeat this amendment and adopt the underlying bill, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlewoman from Texas is recognized.
I thank you, and I thank the gentleman from Georgia for extending his analysis. But I am saddened by the fact that issues dealing with income inequality, where we're simply trying to acknowledge and overtake comments by presidential candidate Mitt Romney, I'm not concerned about the poor. My point about the poor is that you're rich today and poor tomorrow. Catastrophic illness, devastation through a natural disaster, man-made disaster, a terrorist act will put many of us in conditions that we would have never imagined. What Dr. Price has failed to acknowledge, and our Republican friends, is that the dynamic scoring is rooted in anti-tax. It is clear that the bill's language and approach is designed to make it easy to enact deficit-increasing tax cuts. Keeping the Bush tax cuts are not going to improve the economy. Small businesses will. And ensuring that we don't have revenue will definitely send this nation down a periled road of no return. Their own friend, former chairman of the Budget Committee, Jim Nussle, testified, it may not be that the budget process is broken. It may not be, in other words, that tools are broken, but it may be that we're not using it. He, too, acknowledged the faultiness of dynamic scoring. What I'm here today is to ask for this amendment to take into consideration hard-working small business owners, assess whether or not they will be impacted negatively. We already know that agencies are going to have a difficult time in scoring this. We already know that this scoring will have no impact on improving the economy. But the increase in taxes that our colleagues want to do with no balance and increase in revenues to be able to bring down the deficit is the peril that they're sending us to. And they have had hearings, and there have been those who have acknowledged that dynamic scoring does little, but it may impact negatively those hardworking businesses that need to have the resources that would be provided to them by the Small Business Administration in their time of need, or in their time of growth, I ask my colleagues to add one more element of information that will give us guidance as to what dynamic scoring will ultimately mean. There is no doubt that an overwhelming number of Americans agree that we must do revenue, and certainly we must respond to the needs of the American people. None of us are reckless with taxes or increasing taxes, Mr. Speaker. We want to be balanced in what we do. I believe my amendment is a balanced amendment. I ask my colleagues to support it. I yield back my time.
The question is on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Texas. Those in favor will signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like a recorded vote.
A recorded vote having been requested. Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentlewoman from Texas will be postponed. It is now in order to consider Amendment Number 6, printed in Part B of House Report 112-383. For what purpose does the gentleman from Illinois seek recognition?
Mr. Speaker, I have an amendment at the desk.
The clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment Number 6, printed in Part B of House Report Number 112-383, offered by Mr. Quigley of Illinois.
Pursuant to House Resolution 534, the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Quigley, and a member opposed will each control 5 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Illinois.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, my amendment would create a simple CBO-sponsored website where taxpayers could learn how much they would be contributing to major federal spending programs under consideration by Congress. Similarly, it would allow taxpayers to learn how much their taxes would increase or decrease under any major tax legislation being considered by this Congress. The fact is we don't do a good enough job communicating with our constituents. There's too much misinformation out there, and good information isn't accessible enough to Americans without connections to Washington. Try digging through a government website and you'll see the difficulty. My staff gets calls all the time from constituents who are having trouble finding good information about our budget and our tax code. My amendment would take a significant and necessary step towards increasing transparency and accountability. If Congress wants to pass a major new spending program, the tax and the cost to the taxpayer should be made transparent. If Congress wants to pass a tax increase, the cost to the taxpayer should be transparent. And if Congress wants to pass a tax cut, taxpayers should know exactly how they or someone in their tax bracket would benefit. Transparency is the best way to hold lawmakers in Washington accountable, and that's the best way to rein in out-of-control deficits. Our constituents have a right to this information, and we shouldn't skimp when it comes to transparency. I've been working on this taxpayer receipt idea since 2010, and 15 of my colleagues from both sides of the aisle have joined me in supporting similar legislation to this effect. However, at this time, I understand the gentleman from Georgia is opposed to this amendment, which pretty much guarantees that it will go down in a blazing ball of martyrdom. And while I'm a Cub fan and my team hasn't won a World Series since before manned flight, I am realistic. So I will offer to withdraw this amendment if the gentleman will commit to work with me to move this idea forward in a separate venue. Thank you, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia seek recognition?
I claim the time in opposition. Am I to understand that the gentleman has withdrawn the amendment?
He has not withdrawn the amendment yet.
Well, not formally, if I could.
Not formally.
And has the gentleman yielded back?
The gentleman has yielded back.
And the gentleman's able to withdraw the amendment after he's yielded back?
Yes, he is before the rule.
I claim the time in opposition.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to commend the gentleman from Illinois for his amendment, but as we have had our staffs discuss, the amendment would truly mark a significant departure from CBO's historical mission of providing information to policymakers on fiscal and economic implications of the legislation. It would impose a significant new requirement on CBO to calculate the taxpayer benefit or the cost of major legislation, something that candidly, Mr. Chairman, the CBO lacks both the expertise and experience to be able to provide. So though it's commendable, I don't think it has the things to do with the underlying bill. I do believe there are some private sector solutions out there, and look forward to working with the gentleman from Illinois, given that he has agreed to withdraw his amendment in the future as we move forward to, again, to do something that I believe to be commendable, and that is to provide much more information for hardworking taxpayers as well. And given that he has agreed to withdraw the amendment, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back.
Mr. Speaker, I just want to give the gentleman an opportunity to explain his point. I thank him for his willingness to work on this issue together. I now withdraw the amendment.
Without objection, so ordered. It is now in order to consider Amendment number 7, printed in Part B of House Report 112-383. For what purpose does the gentleman from Arizona seek recognition?
On amendment of the desk made in order under the rule.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 7, printed in Part B of House Report number 112-383, offered by Mr. Flake of Arizona.
Pursuant to House Resolution 534, the gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Flake, and a member opposed, each will control 5 minutes. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Arizona.
I thank the gentleman. Let me start by congratulating the Budget Committee and the gentleman from Georgia for bringing this bill to the floor. We need to have more honest budgeting, and this is a step in the right direction. I plan to support it. I have long supported the use of dynamic scoring. In particular, I'm pleased to see this issue on the floor today. It's necessary to ensure that Congress has the most reliable information possible. Not all tax cuts are created equal when it comes to the ability to actually generate tax revenue. And I think that we ought to recognize that, and that's what dynamic scoring is all about. H.R. 3582 requires CBO to provide a supplemental dynamic analysis for a bill with a gross budgetary impact greater than 0.25% of the U.S. gross domestic product in a fiscal year. Based on the current GDP, I believe the threshold would be somewhere in the neighborhood of $40 billion, meaning dynamic scores would be limited to bills with a gross impact of $40 billion a year. Unless I'm mistaken, I believe that setting a trigger for a supplemental macroeconomic analysis would have yielded dynamic scores for somewhere in the neighborhood of a couple dozen bills introduced last year, let alone the number that we considered. The amendment that is ruled in order here would lower the threshold for requiring a supplemental dynamic score to any legislation that would have a budgetary impact greater than $5 billion in a year. Now, I understand that there are concerns with setting the trigger considerably lower than the 0.25% of GDP, including would mean that CBO would have considerably more work to do, and I'm sensitive to that. But I do think that we ought to set the standard a little lower, or the trigger a little lower than $40 billion a year. CBO scores hundreds of bills a year. This is a lot more analysis they would have to do, but I think it is important. But as I mentioned, I'm sensitive to the concerns that have been raised that this would require too much work or too much additional work, which might require additional staffing and everything else at the CBO. And so I'm prepared to withdraw this amendment. But I hope that as this process moves forward, that we can set a standard or a threshold a little lower than $40 billion a year. I think that would benefit lawmakers as we consider the impact of this legislation. And I'm prepared to withdraw the amendment, but I'm happy to yield my friend from Georgia time that he might need.
I appreciate the gentleman for yielding, and I want to thank the gentleman for his amendment. I want to commend him for his wonderful work throughout his congressional career on the fiscal responsibility appropriations process, having a more transparent and fiscally responsible governance, and a more open budgeting process and more responsible budgeting process. We both recognize the imperative of a greater dynamic analysis to the legislation that we have coming before us. What the appropriate threshold is, I think we're probably in the ballpark, but I'm happy to work with the gentleman as we move forward with this legislation to determine what that appropriate threshold is for legislation to be considered in a macroeconomic fashion from CBO. And I appreciate the gentleman's amendment and also appreciate him working with me in the future. And I yield back to the gentleman.
I thank the gentleman. Again, I want to say I support this legislation. It's good legislation, and I look forward to working with the gentleman as we move ahead. And I ask unanimous consent that the amendment be withdrawn.
Is there objection to the unanimous consent request? Seeing none, so granted.
Thanks, Tom.
Now in order to consider amendment number 8 and printed in Part B of House Report 112-383. For what purpose does the gentleman from Rhode Island seek recognition?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will designate the amendment.
Amendment number 8, printed in Part B of House Report number 112-383, offered by Mr. Cicilline of Rhode Island.
Pursuant to House Resolution 534, the gentleman from Rhode Island, Mr. Cicilline, and a member opposed each will control 5 minutes. The gentleman from Rhode Island is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. A little over a year ago, when the Republican